Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
Long before the ill-fated flight of the Apollo 13, there were other disasters which befell the space program. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee perished when a fire in their spacecraft, the Apollo 1, took their lives while still on the launching pad. Years after Apollo 13, 7 more astronauts would die when the space shuttle exploded shortly after takeoff. The crew of the Apollo 13 narrowly escaped becoming one of these grim statistics. Placed in a deadly situation, it took the collaborative efforts of scientists and technicians at Mission Control in Houston and the resolve of Apollo 13 astronauts Jack Swigert, Fred Heiss, and Jim Lovell to conquer the overwhelming odds against their survival. In the scientific community, there is no room for superstitions. However, when the launch of the third manned lunar landing was designated as Apollo 13, superstitious naysayers began to predict doom. However, the attitude of the powers that be within the space agency were unflinching, and since the planned liftoff was only days away, it would appear laughable to renumber the mission at such a late date. Soon other numerological configurations came into play. The Apollo 13 was scheduled to lift off at 1:13 p.m. Houston time, or 13:13 hours in military time. Moreover, the spacecraft would enter the gravitational pull of the moon on April 13th. As fate would have it, astronauts Jack Swigert, Fred Heiss, and Mission Commander Jim Lovell were more than 200,000 miles from Earth and 55 hours into their flight when the unthinkable happened. A sudden explosion violently shook their spacecraft. Warning lights on control panels flashed on and off. Alarms and headphones pulsated. Within seconds, the spacecraft suffered a major power loss. Oxygen was venting into space, depleting the major element the crew needed to sustain life. In Houston, a mad scramble began. Technicians and scientists had to devise methods to rescue the Apollo 13 crew. As the spacecraft continued to speed away from the Earth at more than 20,000 miles per hour, systems continued to fail. And although the trio on board struggled with the countless problems at hand, the calculations regarding life support systems, the conservation of oxygen, rapidly falling temperatures, and altering their course to return to Earth, other thoughts would intrude upon their frantic efforts. And while certainly not a priority during a life or death situation, thoughts of earlier times, of friends and family, of home would somehow find a way to creep into their minds. Thoughts of the long chain of events which would bring these three men to this time and place. In aviation, as in the sports world, hero begat hero. The pioneers of flight were embedded in the minds of any history student. There were the Wright brothers, the first to conquer the air in a motorized plane. Charles Lindbergh, whose record-setting United States to Paris solo flight made him the favored hero of the nation. Amelia Earhart, another pioneer and another record breaker. Eddie Rickenbacker, World War I flying ace. All enjoyed their celebrity, but their exploits would pale in comparison to the new heroes of the space age. A new American hero arrived on the morning of May 6, 1961. All systems were go for America. On that day, in the cold early dawn, people throughout the world were watching and hoping. Even after unprecedented engineering and testing programs, no one could be sure that a man could fly this craft into space and return safely to the Earth. These were tense moments in the early 60s. The risks were great, but they were well taken. The eyes of America and the world watched as Alan Shepard and the thousands who stood behind him in spirit made the American dream of spaceflight a reality.
Liftoff. Liftoff at 34 minutes after the hour.
After that historic flight, President John Kennedy set America on a course toward the moon.
That we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. To go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest invention on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
The first astronauts trained in simulators to master machines more complex than the wildest imaginations of science fiction. As their expertise and abilities grew, space became less of an unknown void and more of an ocean to be sailed. In the formative days of the space program, worldwide tracking stations were established which would circle the globe and make communication with spacecraft in orbit possible. Highly qualified technicians were required to maintain the link of communication which would reach into space. Astronauts' cameras gave a new perspective of the Earth, photographing the planet for the first time from the lofty vantage of space. This was a time of new hope and confidence. In the final Mercury flight, astronaut Gordon Cooper controlled re-entry by hand and splashed down only 8,700 yards from the prime recovery vessel. Now America was going to the moon, and every flight brought nearer that ultimate goal. Project Gemini, with a spacecraft large enough for 2 astronauts, was man's next step into space. Many questions still remained along the pathway to the moon. Could astronauts walk outside a spacecraft and work in space? Gemini flights proved they could. Could 2 spacecraft rendezvous in space? In Gemini, 2 crafts maneuvered within a few feet of another. And in Gemini, astronauts lived in space for 2 weeks, eating, sleeping, and working without ever leaving their spacecraft. Obviously, long-duration flights would be necessary for extended missions to the moon. And in another innovation, sophisticated fuel cells were used on the Gemini missions, replacing obsolete conventional batteries. Docking one spacecraft with another would be a primary requirement for a lunar journey. It was in Project Gemini that a spacecraft was first docked to a target vehicle. The propulsion system of the target vehicle was fired to boost the docked spacecraft to a record orbit of 741 nautical miles and provided yet another view of the Earth never before seen. The base of experience gained in Mercury was refined and extended in Project Gemini. Team players in Project Gemini were called from both government and private industry to form the nucleus of expertise to go to the moon and contribute greatly to new approaches to management of projects of large magnitude. Re-entry flight path control was an important prerequisite for a lunar mission. When returning from the moon at a speed of 25,000 miles per hour, spacecraft re-entry had to be controlled within 2 degrees. The Gemini spacecraft was designed to conform to that degree of accuracy, and the Gemini's flights demonstrated the success of this technique. The Gemini program, built upon the foundation of Mercury, added new experience to the space program's bank of knowledge and new capabilities to the body of technology that would take astronauts to the moon. At the conclusion of Project Gemini, questions about the abilities of man and his spacecraft had been answered, and the 2,400 photographs taken while in orbit were used by scientists the world over to greatly increase the understanding of our planet. The 12 flights of Gemini had provided the experience and confidence to take the next step into space. Project Apollo. The immensity of the launch vehicle was equal to the enormity of the journey. Every part of this 6 million pound spacecraft had been subjected to intensive testing. Even before it left the launch pad, the Apollo craft was considered one of the greatest technological accomplishments in the history of mankind. The mission control teams had been refined and strengthened through the early programs to reach their greatest level of proficiency. America was now ready to send a man to the moon. It was Jim Lovell's lifelong dream to be the first American to walk on the moon. Lovell was amongst the second group of astronauts chosen to participate in America's space program. Lovell began intensive training for the Apollo 8 mission, which would take man around the moon for the first time. December 21st, 1968. The shortest day of the year, but in significance, perhaps the longest in the flow of history.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We are still go at this time. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have cleared the top.
Tower clear, 13 seconds.
The United States was undertaking the most distant voyage ever attempted by man. For the first time, 3 Americans rode the Saturn V moon rocket.
Apollo 8 Houston, you are go for staging, over. Staging. Our set complete, SEP. Roger, understand, SEP. Apollo 8. We hear you loud and clear, Apollo 8. Okay, the first stage was very smooth, and this one is smoother. Apollo 8 Houston, your trajectory and guidance are go, over. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, you're looking real good, Frank.
Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Jim Lovell were about to leave their cradle Earth and face the infinite frontier.
Apollo 8 Houston. Go ahead, Houston. Apollo 8, you are go for TLI, over. Roger, understand, we're go for TLI.
Borman, Anders, and Lovell were now ready for the maneuver that would send them to the moon. As the world listened and watched, its people were overtaken by a new awareness, an awareness that they were witnessing the overture to the ultimate destiny of man.
Lovell confirms ignition. And the thrust is okay, booster says.
On board the spacecraft and in mission control, the men of Apollo 8 watched the readouts of velocity buildup in feet per second, the numbers snowballing towards the velocity which would allow the spacecraft to escape Earth's gravity.
And Borman says we've got SECO. Cutoff was right on the second.
With the cutoff of their third stage engine, Apollo 8 was traveling faster than any men had before, a coasting uphill climb against the pull of their native planet. Now the third stage was just a useless mass. It was jettisoned and later put into an orbit around the sun. The crew now had an unobstructed view of Earth.
Houston, Apollo 8, how do you read? You're loud and clear, Frank. How are you? Roger, we're loud and clear. We're taking pictures of the S4B. The post-separation sequence is completed, and we seem to have a high gain. Give us a clue as to what it looks like from way up there. Roger. I can see the entire Earth now out of the center window. I can see Florida, Cuba, Central America, the whole northern half of Central America, in fact, all the way down through Argentina and down through Chile. You picked a good day for it. Houston, for information, I'm looking through the scanning telescope now, and I see millions of stars, most of them The vending from the S4B.
The crew of the Apollo 8 now settled down to the routine of the outward flight. Systems checks, observations, navigational star sightings.
Jim, they've just been looking at your marks with respect to accuracy, and they figure they're within a couple thousandths of a degree of the theoretical optimum.
Lovell's proficiency in navigating the spacecraft with its onboard optical instruments would eventually earn him the nickname, the man with the golden fingers. His speed was such that he would be requested to slow down, so the earthbound machines recording the data could keep up with him. The accuracy of his sightings were virtually flawless, symbolic of the entire mission. A mission so accurate that several of the planned mid-course corrections would be dropped as unnecessary. Astronauts, spacecraft, flight controllers, computers. The precision was fantastic. Finally, on the second day out, the world looked in on the crew via television.
This transmission is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We've been 31 hours, about 20 minutes into flight. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon.
So Apollo 8 glided on silently farther from Earth than man had ever been before. A microscopic dot of life in the cosmic void. Around the world, in countries like Spain, Australia, and the United States, the gigantic antennae of worldwide tracking stations monitored the progress of the Apollo 8. Only for the 40 minutes of its transit behind the moon on each orbit would Apollo 8 lose contact with the Earth. On the day before Christmas, television viewers watched as the Apollo 8 made its second broadcast to Earth.
All right, you're all looking at yourselves as seen from 180,000 miles out in space. Mike, what I keep imagining is if I'm some lonely traveler from another planet, what I think about the Earth from this altitude, whether I think it'd be inhabited or not.
You don't see anybody waving, is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm just kind of curious whether I would land on the blue or the brown part of the Earth. You better hope we land in the blue part.
Shortly after they turned off the television camera, Borman, Anders, and Lovell ended their long climb away from Earth, crossing the point where the gravity of the Earth just balanced that of the moon. They became the first men to fall toward another celestial body. Now the time approached for the most immense commitment of the mission, Lunar Orbit Insertion, LOI. A burn of the service module engine would place Apollo 8 into orbit around the moon. Up to this time, without further major maneuvers, the spacecraft would merely loop around the moon and return to Earth. Once the burn was made, Apollo 8 would be held by the moon's gravity field until a later burn would push it free.
Apollo 8, this is Houston at 6804, your goal for LOI.
Okay, Apollo 8 is go.
You're riding the best bird we can find.
Lunar orbit insertion would take place on the backside of the moon. With the moon between the spacecraft and the Earth, all contact would be lost until it appeared on the other side, and no one would know if the crucial maneuver was successful or not for 40 agonizing minutes of silence, even though in mission control they anticipated loss of signal from Apollo 8. Now mission control in the world could only wait for the first contact with Apollo 8 as it emerged from behind the moon.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. There's a cheer in this room. This is Apollo Control Houston, switching now to the voice of Jim Lovell.
By 60.5, good to hear your voice.
Apollo 8 Houston, what does the old moon look like from 60 miles, over?
Okay, Houston, the moon is essentially gray, no color, looks like plaster of Paris, or sort of a grayish beach sand. You can see quite a bit of detail. The craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them. Some of them are newer. Many of them look like, especially the round ones, look like hit by meteorites or projectiles of some sort. Langrenus is quite a huge crater. It's got a central cone to it. The walls of the crater are terraced, about 6 or 7 different terraces on the way down.
Saw and heard the first live broadcast of the lunar surface.
Hey, Bill, how would you describe the color of the moon from here?
The color of the moon looks a very whitish gray, like dirty beach sand, and with lots of footprints in it.
Don't these two craters look like pickaxes striking concrete, leaving a lot of fine alien dust? There's no trouble picking out features that we learned on the map.
Certainly looks like we're picking the more interesting parts of the moon to land in. The backside looks like a sand pile my kids have been playing in for a long time. It's all beat up, no definition, just a lot of bumps and holes. The area that we're over right now gives some hint of possible volcanic, so I really can't eyeball it at the moment to pin that down. No, there are some craters and buildups definitely suggest volcanic activity.
Next came a Christmas Eve message that the world would never forget.
Welcome from the moon, Houston.
Thank you.
The moon is a different thing to each one of us. I know my own impression is that it's a vast, lonely, forbidding type existence or expanse of nothing. It looks rather like clouds and clouds of pumice stone. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Now the crew of the Apollo 8 faced a critical task, the firing of the service module engine for TEI, Trans-Earth Insertion, and the trip home. There was no no-go decision on this one. It had to go. For the final time, the Apollo 8 would pass behind the moon, out of contact with Earth for this most critical of all the burns. On the ground, the men waited.
Apollo 8, Houston. Apollo 8, Houston. Apollo 8, Houston. Apollo 8, Houston.
Apollo 8, over.
Hello, Apollo 8. Loud and clear.
Roger. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
That's affirmative. You're the best ones to know.
3 very tired astronauts were on their way home, and with them in spirit rode an army of engineers, scientists, technicians, programmers, flight controllers, all those whose dedicated efforts were Apollo 8. After catching up on their homeward-bound rest, there was more of a mood of elation, contrasted with the mood of loneliness as they were outward-bound.
I told Michael you guys are up there, and he said, who's driving?
That's a good question.
I think Isaac Newton's doing most of the driving right now.
We were enjoying the Christmas holiday on Earth, but paused in the celebration to watch 3 travelers heading home.
It appears that we did a grave injustice to the food people. Santa Claus brought us a TV dinner each, which is delicious. Turkey and gravy, cranberry sauce, grape punch, outstanding.
Roger, Jim. Glad to hear it. Yeah, we're down here eating cold coffee and bologna sandwiches.
The final plunge towards Earth occurred on schedule on December 27th. The command module jettisoned the service module to expose the main heat shield, allowing itself to assume entry attitude. It slammed into the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour.
Ken Mattingly just put in a call and just frankly labeled it a radio check. He's gotten no responses yet. Ken Mattingly puts in another call. And there's Jim Lovell.
We're in real good shape here. Real fine.
So ended the flight of the Apollo 8. Scientist, engineer, astronaut, the world, all had followed the progress of the Apollo 8. For the flight of the Apollo 8 was preparation, an advanced scout marking the way for those who would follow, those who would orbit, those who would land, navigate, track, observe, record, describe, those who would forevermore be part of man's historic leap from Earth to the moon. And for a brief moment in history, the nations of Earth were united in the infinity of space. Now it was May 18th, 1969. America was almost ready. Man had orbited the moon once. Man had test-flown the lunar module, the lunar landing craft, in Earth orbit once. But before we could commit to a lunar landing, there were a number of things to be worked out. This was the mission of Apollo 10. In the words of its commander, Tom Stafford, to sort out all the unknowns and pave the way for a lunar landing. The veteran crew of Tom Stafford, Gene Cernan, and Tom Young made up the trio of astronauts who would pilot the Apollo 10 to the moon.
We are go for a mission to the moon at this time. Tom Stafford reports they are go. We're coming up on the 20-second mark. T-minus 20 seconds and counting. 17 seconds and counting. Guidance internal. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. Engines on. 5, 4, 3, 2. All engines running. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff 49 minutes past the hour.
Roger.
Good ignition on the second stage.
Man, that staging was quite a sequence. Just like old times. It's beautiful out there.
The mood on this troubleshooting mission was lighthearted, a far cry from the tone which would come later with Apollo 13.
And dear, for one time, you have your choice. If you don't like things right side up, you can go upside down.
I just do whatever he says.
Roger, down here. Okay, we got one in each direction.
That's the only way to fly.
Okay, we're about to finish that ambulance thing, and we're going to psych out. Okay, and tomorrow we should be around the moon.
Roger. Reveille. Up all hands. Heave out. Trice up. Clean sweep down, 4.5.
Apollo 10, Houston, sounds like we're ready for a naval drill on the flight deck.
And here is your horoscope reading for today, Apollo 10. Tom Stafford, you should concentrate on finishing things that you have already started. Today's pace will be moderate. Use this time to take inventory. John Young, you will have a slow day today. This will give you time to concentrate on the work ahead. You will enjoy your surroundings and companions.
And Gino, your horoscope reads, give careful thought to your working and driving habits. Do something nice for your friends.
Soon, Stafford, Young, and Cernan became the second trio to orbit the moon, and the first to broadcast live color pictures of Earth from space.
You're going about 6,000 feet a second.
The next day, Stafford and Cernan entered the lunar module named Snoopy for their test descent, during which they would hover above the moon. John Young would remain behind in the command module called Charlie Brown.
It's a fantastic
The separation of Command Module, Charlie Brown, and the Lunar Module, Snoopy, would take place behind the Moon. When contact was re-established, Charlie Brown and Snoopy were ready for the separation maneuver prior to descent. The word from John Young and Charlie Brown was,
"You'll never know how big this thing gets when there ain't nobody in here but one guy. You'll never know how small it looks when you're as far away as we are." Hey, John, if you get a chance, you can turn on the radar transponder. We'll correlate the VHF ranging with it. Okay, my transponder is on. Transponder is on and the test switch is in operation. I should be getting a radar signal here, and I sure don't.
An electronic piece of radar equipment in the command module was not functioning. Without it, there would be no rendezvous and no low-orbit descent in the lunar module to the Moon. In mission control and in the two spacecraft, switch positions and procedures were rechecked, for the descent and subsequent rendezvous were the heart of the Apollo 10 mission. From mission control, one last-ditch instruction was sent up.
Roger, how about trying to recycle the power switch, Charlie Brown?
In the command module, Young turned the switch off, then on again.
Hey, that did it, you guys. It's on. Hey, and I got signal strength, though, buddy. What do you know about that?
A little thing, a stuck switch, but it nearly scuttled the entire mission.
Okay, Jose, say adios, and we'll see you back in about 6 hours. Right. Have a good time while we're gone, babe. Yeah, don't get lonesome out there, John. And don't accept any TEI updates.
Hovering 8 miles above the surface of the Moon, surveys were made of potential landing sites selected for Apollo 11.
Yeah, okay, the approach end looks a lot smoother than some of the orbiter photos show. And still estimate 25 to 30% say semi-clear area, so if the limb has enough hover time, at least from what we can see at 50,000 feet, it should not be a problem. Or if you come down in the wrong area and you don't have the hover time, you're going to have to shove off.
With the survey of the landing sites completed, Snoopy redocked with Charlie Brown.
Hey, Joe, we're about ready to dock. Stand by. Okay, John, you're into about 5 feet, babe. Looking beautiful. Hello, yes, Snoopy and Charlie Brown are hugging each other. Roger that. We heard them down here.
Following one final orbit around the Moon, the Apollo 10 began its descent towards Earth.
Roger, Houston, we are returning to the Earth. Over. Glad to have you on the way back home, Ted.
The Apollo 10 had met all of the objectives on its mission. Problems had been met, faced, and solved, for that was the mission, to sort out the unknowns and pave the way for an actual moon landing. But as the men of Apollo 10 were reunited with their families and friends, attention was already turning elsewhere. Apollo 11 had been rolled out to its launch pad even before Apollo 10 had entered its orbit above the Moon. Now it stood awaiting its voyage into a lunar sea.